Picture a silence. Not the kind that lulls a restless mind into peace, but the silence that vibrates like a storm beneath still waters. A man stands before it and it does not yield. No soft explanation, no word to soothe his gnawing uncertainty. Just absence, raw, unrelenting. For him, that silence is not empty. It is an accusation, a mirror, and a wound. What he feels is not simply confusion. It is a confrontation with parts of himself he has long hidden, parts he fears to acknowledge. Carl Jung once wrote that everything we deny in ourselves eventually confronts us in another. In this silence, a man hears not her voice but his shadow whispering. He begins to wonder, was he dismissed? Was he unseen? Or worse, was he unworthy? For a man bound by pride, this is the slow tightening of a vice. His ego had promised him control, yet her silence dissolves it. But here lies the paradox. What he feels in this silence is not only fear, it is obsession. It is the magnetic pull of mystery. Just as the hunter grows restless when his prey vanishes into the dark forest, the masculine psyche awakens when it cannot see, cannot predict, cannot possess. What slips from his grasp becomes what he most desires. And yet the stakes are dangerous. If he misunderstands this silence, he may spiral into projection. He may paint her as cold, cruel, manipulative. His unintegrated shadow demands an enemy, and in her silence he finds it. This is the wound. But for the woman who understands the depth of this silence, there is also a gift. Her quiet becomes not an absence, but a presence, a mirror through which he is invited, or forced, to meet his truest self. Still, the silence cuts deeper than words because words can be argued with, dismissed, reshaped. Silence cannot. Silence is final, absolute. In a world saturated with noise, messages, and endless digital pings, a woman's refusal to explain becomes thunder. He cannot escape it. He feels it in his chest, in his skin, in the restless spinning of his mind at night. It gnaws, it burns, it humiliates, and it tempts. The truth is this: when a woman falls silent, she does not simply vanish from a man's world, she occupies it. Her silence echoes louder than any speech. It forces him into the barren terrain of his own psyche, where his shadow waits with sharpened teeth. If he has not done his inner work, this silence becomes unbearable. It unmasks him. He may lash out. He may withdraw. Or if the archetypal pattern runs deep enough, he may begin to chase her, not out of love, but out of fear of losing what he never truly held. This is why silence is not neutral. It is archetypal. It belongs to the realm of the sovereign queen who does not plead, does not explain, but reigns in presence. And it belongs to the siren whose silence is not passivity but lure, drawing him deeper into the ocean of his unconscious. One silence carries sovereignty, the other seduction. Both cut, both transform. But imagine what happens when a man cannot tell the difference. Imagine what he feels when he cannot discern whether her silence is rejection or initiation. Here the stakes rise higher. If he interprets her silence as abandonment, he collapses into the wounded king archetype, brooding, bitter, obsessed with restoring a pride that was never secure. If he interprets it as mystery, as initiation, his ego trembles but his soul stirs. He feels fear and fascination. He feels threatened and alive. What a man feels when her silence cuts deeper than words is not merely about her. It is about him. It is about the cracks in the armor of his ego, the unspoken hunger of his shadow, and the way the feminine presence exposes them without uttering a syllable. That silence is both wound and gift. It can drive him into madness or into awakening. The risk for her is real too. Silence without clarity may awaken his shadow, but if he has not matured, he may not face it. He may project it onto her. And here lies the cost. Many women, fearing this backlash, fill the silence with words, justifications, and explanations. They dilute their own sovereignty. They give him back his comfort at the expense of their own power. But what if she did? What if silence, when chosen with intention, is the most potent language she could ever speak. Silence, when chosen with intention, is not absence but presence magnified. It is the moment when the sovereign queen reclaims her throne, not by striking with words but by withholding them. For a man, this is not a void. It is a storm that demands reckoning. He feels the shift immediately. The warmth that once flowed so freely now withdraws, and in its place is a mirror he cannot turn away from. He feels exposed, as though the ground beneath his feet has betrayed him. Why does it cut so deeply? Because silence strips away illusion. Words can be twisted, excused, misinterpreted, but silence holds no such mercy. It is final. It offers no reassurance for the ego to cling to, no loophole for his pride to crawl through. It confronts him with the truth he most fears, that perhaps he is not in control, that perhaps her presence was never his to command. And in that confrontation, his shadow rises. For some men, this silence is unbearable. It becomes a cruel emptiness, echoing with the voices of every past rejection, every wound of inadequacy. It feels like abandonment. And abandonment is one of the deepest wounds a man can carry because it reminds him of the first exile, separation from the feminine presence that nurtured him. When her silence awakens that memory, he may not even recognize it as memory. All he knows is that it hurts. And in that hurt, he feels small, unworthy, and exposed. Yet paradoxically, this same silence ignites obsession. What is withheld becomes the very thing he cannot forget. The hunter archetype awakens. He begins to pace, to imagine, to strategize. Her silence turns her into an enigma and the enigma into his pursuit. And here lies the double edge. Obsession is not love, yet it feels like it. It carries the same intensity, the same inability to look away. And so he confuses his compulsion for devotion. This is where danger lurks. If the woman's silence is used unconsciously, if it is born from fear, avoidance, or passive aggression, it feeds his shadow without guiding him. He becomes lost in projection, chasing ghosts that have nothing to do with her true essence. But if her silence comes from sovereignty, from the place where she knows her worth and does not need to explain it, then her silence becomes initiation. It becomes the moment when he is called to shed his ego and meet her, not as a boy demanding comfort, but as a man capable of depth. The stakes for him are immense. If he resists, he remains trapped in the cycle of projection and obsession, chasing what he cannot name and resenting what he cannot possess. His relationships fracture, his pride corrodes him from within, and his hunger grows insatiable. But if he accepts the silence as initiation, he must face his shadow, integrate the parts of himself he has denied, and rise into greater wholeness. Imagine the man who chooses the former path. He misreads her silence as punishment and his ego thrashes. He sends messages, demands explanations, grows resentful at her withdrawal. He convinces himself she is cruel, cold, manipulative. But the truth is that her silence was never cruelty, it was a mirror. He simply could not bear what it showed him, and in his blindness he pushes her further away. His silence becomes hers forever. Now imagine the man who chooses the latter path. He feels the sting of her withdrawal, but instead of rushing to fill the void with noise, he pauses. He listens, not to her words because there are none, but to what stirs inside him. He feels the shadow rise, the wounded pride, the fear of abandonment, and instead of projecting it outward, he sits with it. He begins to see her silence not as absence but as invitation, an invitation to grow, an invitation to meet her in a deeper place, one beyond ego, one beyond control. This is the moment where silence transforms. For him, it becomes the teacher. For her, it becomes the crown. She does not lose power by explaining, nor does she weaponize her quiet. She simply embodies it. And in that embodiment, she forces the choice. Will he face himself or will he run? But even for the woman, this path carries weight. Because silence without consciousness is not sovereignty, it is avoidance. If she withholds to punish, she entangles herself in the same shadow game she seeks to transcend. But when she holds silence as a sovereign act, she does not seek to wound, she seeks to reflect. Her silence is not punishment, it is clarity. It is her saying without words, "If you cannot meet me here, you cannot meet me at all." And so, what a man feels in her silence is ultimately determined by the work he has, or has not, done in himself. To the boy, it feels like rejection. To the man, it feels like initiation. To the sovereign woman, it is neither cruelty nor game, but the simplest truth of all. Her silence is her power, her presence, her uncompromising reflection. But what happens when his shadow resists? When silence does not lead him to awakening but to collapse? When a man's shadow resists silence, what follows is collapse. His ego cannot accept that her withdrawal is not a punishment but a mirror. The silence gnaws at him, each moment stretching into eternity, and the more he resists, the more unbearable it becomes. In the dead of night, when the world is quiet and his mind has nowhere left to hide, he begins to feel the weight of his own emptiness. That is the moment when the shadow tightens its grip. Collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. A man who drowns himself in distraction, who scrolls endlessly, drinks too much, or seeks fleeting validation from someone else. Other times it erupts. He lashes out, demands explanations, accuses her of cruelty. In our case, he is not fighting her silence. He is fighting the reflection of his own inner wounds. Jung called this projection. The parts of himself he cannot bear, he casts onto her. And so her silence, which could have been the catalyst for his growth, becomes the battlefield of his denial. But collapse has another face. It is the wounded king, sitting alone on his broken throne, surrounded by echoes of past failures. He feels betrayed, humiliated, stripped of power. And yet beneath the rubble of his pride, something stirs. Because collapse, though painful, is the necessary threshold of transformation. The ego must fracture before the soul can emerge. In this way, silence becomes both the wound and the initiation ritual. The cost of resisting this initiation is immense. He remains trapped in cycles of shallow attraction, unable to hold depth. He confuses control with love, desire with possession. His relationships decay under the weight of his fear because he cannot bear to be reflected. The silence that could have awakened him instead becomes a curse, haunting him in every woman he meets. And so he repeats the pattern, chasing, grasping, resenting, always hungry, never whole. But what if he does not resist? What if in the silence he allows himself to shatter? It is here, at the moment of collapse, that something profound occurs. For the first time, he sees that the silence was never about her at all. It was about him. Her quiet was a mirror, not a weapon. It revealed the boy within, the one who feared abandonment, who equated presence with worth, who demanded words to soothe his insecurity. And in seeing that boy, he also sees the man he could become. This is the red thread. Collapse is not the end. It is the passage. The man who dares to stay in the silence, who resists the urge to project or escape, discovers that what he feared most was not her absence but himself. And once he faces that, the silence transforms. It no longer cuts, it heals. For the woman, this is where her sovereignty must hold steady. She must resist the temptation to rescue him from his silence, to soothe him with words that dilute her own power. Because if she rescues him, she robs him of initiation. She returns him to the comfort of the boy rather than calling forth the strength of the man. Her silence, then, is the fire through which he must walk. To withhold it is not cruelty, it is faith. Faith that he can rise. Faith that the silence will not destroy him but refine him. And here the archetypes shift. He, once the wounded king, has the chance to become the silent hunter, no longer frantic, no longer desperate, but attuned. The hunter who listens, who waits, who learns to sense what cannot be spoken. And she, the sovereign queen, does not need to chase or explain. She reigns, and in her reign she teaches without words. Together, they move into deeper union, not through noise, but through presence. Yet not every man rises. And this is the darkest truth of silence. It separates. It draws the line between those who will face their shadow and those who will forever flee it. For the man who cannot endure the mirror, her silence will always feel like cruelty. For the man who can, it becomes the key to his transformation. But what does this transformation look like? What does a man become when he passes through the fire of silence and does not collapse, but emerges on the other side? When a man endures silence and emerges transformed, he is no longer the same. The boy who once clung to constant reassurance dies in that stillness, and in his place, the man begins to rise. He learns that silence does not destroy connection, it deepens it. Silence is not abandonment, it is invitation. And in recognizing this, he moves from fear to reverence. For him, the transformation begins in the smallest of shifts. Instead of demanding her words, he begins to listen to the space between them. He notices the tension in the air, the rhythm of her absence, the unspoken truths that no language can contain. What once felt like punishment now feels like presence. He realizes that her silence is not rejection, it is sovereignty. And in this recognition, he no longer seeks to dominate it, he seeks to honor it. This is the man who has integrated his shadow. He no longer projects his fear of abandonment onto her quiet. Instead, he sees it as a mirror of his own unfinished work, and he accepts the task. This is where the silent hunter archetype takes form, patient, attuned, capable of moving in the unseen. He no longer chases blindly. He observes. He listens. He learns to hold space without filling it. And in that space, obsession transforms into devotion. For the woman, this transformation is equally profound. Her silence, once feared as a source of conflict, becomes her crown. She no longer doubts its power or feels compelled to dilute it with justifications. She knows that her silence is not emptiness but embodiment. It says, "I will not lower myself to explain my worth. I will not beg to be understood. I will not rescue you from the mirror of yourself." And so the dynamic between them shifts. No longer a battle of ego and pride, it becomes a dance between sovereignty and presence. She reigns without apology, and he, stripped of his illusions, learns to meet her without masks. What he feels in her silence now is not terror, but awe. And awe, unlike fear, binds him not to his ego but to his soul. But there is another layer to this transformation, one often overlooked. Silence is not only personal, it is archetypal. In Jung's language, it belongs to the anima, the feminine presence within the male psyche that guides him toward wholeness. When he feels her silence cut deeper than words, he is not only confronting her, he is confronting the anima within himself, the eternal feminine that his ego has suppressed. To honor her silence is to honor that inner presence. And in doing so, he reclaims a part of himself he did not know was lost. This is why the silence of a woman can feel so dangerous to a man. It is not merely her silence, it is his own soul calling him to account. If he ignores it, he falls deeper into fragmentation. But if he accepts it, he steps into integration. And in this integration, something extraordinary happens. He no longer seeks to possess her. He seeks to understand her, not with words, not with demands, but with presence. He learns the rarest of arts, the art of sitting with mystery. For her, this is liberation. No longer trapped in cycles of over-explaining, she embodies the sovereign queen whose silence is her throne. She becomes the siren whose stillness is more alluring than any song. And she becomes the priestess whose silence is initiation, not rejection. Each archetype converges, not as roles she plays, but as truths she embodies. Yet the stakes remain high, because not every man who feels this silence will rise into wholeness. Many will flee, many will resent, many will project. For these men, silence remains a wound, never a gift. But for the few who endure it, the transformation is lasting. They emerge not as boys demanding comfort, but as men capable of depth, capable of holding space, capable of true love. And here lies the paradox. The silence that once felt like death becomes the birthplace of intimacy. The wound becomes the gift. What he feels at last is not abandonment, but union. Not because she filled the silence with words, but because he learned to hear what words could never say. But what happens when silence is tested not only in the private space between two souls, but in the chaos of the modern world, where constant noise and endless distractions threaten to drown it out? The modern world wages war against silence. Every device hums, every platform clamors for attention, every moment risks being swallowed by noise. In such a landscape, silence is not simply rare, it is radical. For a man who has never confronted his own shadow, her silence becomes unbearable precisely because the world has trained him to avoid it. He fills every void with distraction, every pause with scrolling, every question with endless noise. When she withdraws into stillness, he cannot follow because he has never learned to sit with himself. This is where the sovereign queen's silence grows even more potent. In an age of constant availability, her refusal to respond immediately, her choice to step back from the noise, becomes a declaration of power. It says, "My worth is not measured by my accessibility. My presence is not reduced to your demand for instant gratification." And for the man caught in the illusion of control, this silence is a shattering blow. He feels the cut more deeply now, because silence in a digital age is amplified. A seen message with no reply becomes an echo chamber for his shadow. A day without her presence online becomes an eternity in his mind. The hunter in him awakens, not because she plays a game, but because her absence exposes the emptiness of his constant need for stimulation. What he feels is not simply rejection, but exposure. He is forced to confront how little control he truly has. The stakes are dangerous here because digital silence can spiral into distorted meaning. His shadow leaps to conclusions. She is cruel. She is testing me. She is with someone else. His projections multiply in the void, and if his ego is untempered, he may lash out, demanding explanations, clinging to control, or seeking revenge. This is the wound of the modern wounded king. Unable to sit with the silence, he drowns in the noise of his own insecurity. But for the man willing to rise, the digital silence becomes initiation just as much as physical silence. He begins to learn patience, restraint, and depth. He realizes that her silence is not a rejection of him, but an invitation to meet himself. The sovereign queen in the digital age does not waste her energy proving her worth with endless availability. She embodies presence by stepping back, by letting her stillness speak louder than any word, any post, any reply. And for him, this silence becomes a test of his own sovereignty. Can he withstand the discomfort without rushing to fill it? Can he honor her presence even when it is not constant? Can he allow her to exist as her own sovereign being, rather than a constant source of validation? These questions cut deeper than words, and in them, his transformation is measured. The stakes for her are profound as well, because in a world that demands constant communication, choosing silence can feel dangerous. She risks being misunderstood, labeled cold, detached, or unfeeling. But here lies her power. By embracing the silence as her throne, she refuses to collapse under the weight of expectation. She does not abandon compassion, but she does abandon explanation. She understands that her silence, when rooted in sovereignty, is not cruelty, it is clarity. It separates those who can meet her in depth from those who cannot. And so, in the chaos of the modern world, silence becomes the rarest gift. It is the pause that reveals character. It is the mirror that no noise can blur. and it is the filter that separates obsession born of insecurity from devotion born of depth. But there remains a darker possibility, one that every sovereign woman must face. What happens when her silence is not met with growth, but with the collapse of the man who cannot endure it? What happens when silence does not refine him, but consumes him? When silence is met with collapse, the story takes its darkest turn. For the man who has built his entire identity on control, her withdrawal feels like annihilation. He cannot hear her voice in the quiet, so he fills the void with the worst parts of himself. Resentment festers. Insecurity becomes obsession. And what began as a simple pause in communication spirals into an inner storm he cannot calm. This is the shadow's final defense, to twist silence into rejection, to convince him that her stillness is cruelty, and that he must act to reclaim what was taken from him. Here lies the danger, for obsession, when fueled by fear, becomes destructive. He may chase her more aggressively, send words he will later regret, or retreat into cold detachment, vowing never to be vulnerable again. Both paths are born from the same wound, the terror of facing the void within. Yet within this collapse lies his greatest chance for awakening, because collapse strips the ego bare. In the ruins of his certainty, he begins to ask the questions he once avoided. Why does her silence wound me so deeply? What am I terrified of hearing in the quiet? What have I been running from in myself? These questions pierce the heart of his shadow, forcing him to confront what no distraction could ever silence. For the sovereign queen, this collapse is not her responsibility to mend. She is not the healer of wounds he refuses to acknowledge, nor the balm for fears he refuses to face. But her silence can act as the catalyst, the unseen hand that pushes him into his own confrontation. Some men rise from this collapse, tempered, humbled, awakened to their own depth. Others shatter completely, unable to bear the weight of introspection. And this distinction reveals the truth. Silence does not create weakness, it reveals it. In Jungian terms, this is the confrontation with the shadow, the moment where the ego can no longer avoid its reflection. The silence has stripped away every defense, every illusion, every mask. What remains is the raw, unfiltered truth of his inner world. For some, this truth is unbearable. For others, it is the very fire that forges their strength. And for her, the silence remains her throne. She does not speak to ease his collapse, nor does she rush to reassure him. Because the deeper wisdom of the feminine knows, the man who cannot endure the silence is not ready to endure her. Her gift is clarity, but clarity often arrives as a wound before it is understood as grace. This collapse marks the threshold between obsession and devotion. If he remains bound by fear, his obsession consumes him. If he rises through the collapse, his devotion deepens, rooted not in insecurity but in reverence. He begins to see her not as a source of validation, but as a mirror calling him into sovereignty. But what then becomes of the man who rises? What transformation does silence awaken in him once the collapse has passed? And how does the sovereign queen embody her power when faced with a man who has touched his own shadow and returned stronger? The man who rises from collapse is not the same as the one who fell. He has faced the abyss of her silence, and instead of fleeing, he has allowed it to strip away the illusions he once clung to. The endless chatter of his ego, the frantic grasping for control, the restless search for external validation, these no longer hold the same power. What remains is quieter, sharper, and infinitely more resilient. For the first time, he can sit in silence without fear. He no longer needs her immediate reply to prove his worth. He no longer interprets her stillness as rejection, but as a mirror, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes tender, always revealing. In this shift, his attraction deepens, but it is no longer the frantic obsession of the untempered ego. It becomes devotion, rooted in respect and steadiness. The sovereign queen feels this transformation instantly, for energy speaks louder than words. She no longer senses the grasping, the insecurity, the desperate hunger that once filled the space between them. Instead, she feels presence, a man who can stand beside her without demanding, who can honor her silence without collapsing into it. And in this, she discovers her own liberation. Her silence is no longer a weapon or even a test. It is simply her truth, and now it is safe to embody it fully. This is the paradox Jung so often illuminated, that the gift is hidden inside the wound. His obsession was never the problem, it was the shadow behind it. Her silence was never the cruelty, it was the catalyst for his awakening. Together, wound and gift weave the paradox of attraction, a dance as old as myth. And yet, even in this ascent, the stakes remain high, because not every man who rises will remain in his newfound sovereignty. Temptations pull him back, the temptation to demand again, to control again, to slip into old patterns of projection. Sovereignty is not achieved in a single moment of awakening, but forged in the discipline of returning to presence, again and again, even when the silence grows heavy. For her, too, the challenge deepens. To embody sovereignty is not only to withdraw, but to choose when to return with grace. Silence is powerful, but it is not the whole of her gift. There comes a time when her words must return, not as explanations, but as declarations. When she speaks again after silence, her words carry the weight of her throne. They are not scattered like noise, but placed like jewels, deliberate and luminous. This is the essence of feminine power in its fullness, the wisdom to know when to be silent and the courage to know when to speak. Both are weapons, both are gifts, and in the man who has faced his own shadow, she finds one capable of receiving them. But what is the final form of this alchemy? What does it look like when silence does not destroy, but transforms both, the woman who wields it and the man who endures it? What happens when silence itself becomes the sacred language between them? When silence becomes sacred, it ceases to be a battlefield. No longer is it the weapon of withdrawal or the echo chamber of insecurity. It transforms into a shared language, one that transcends words, one that binds the masculine and feminine at their deepest archetypal core. For the sovereign queen, silence is her crown. It is the space in which her essence radiates without explanation, where her boundaries speak louder than defenses, where her presence alone defines the rhythm of connection. She knows now that she does not need to fill the air to prove her worth, nor does she need to soothe his discomfort to preserve the bond. Her silence is clarity itself, a mirror that reveals the truth no words could touch. For the man who has endured collapse and risen into presence, silence is no longer terror. It is an invitation. He can now meet her gaze without flinching, hold her silence without breaking, and enter into its stillness with curiosity rather than fear. In Jungian language, he has integrated a fragment of his anima, the feminine within himself, making him capable of seeing her not as an adversary, but as a mirror of his own depths. Together, they arrive at a new form of intimacy, one forged not by constant affirmation, nor by endless chatter, but by the profound trust that silence will not be misused. In that quiet, the siren's mystery becomes luminous, the sovereign queen's throne becomes unshakable, and the wounded king finds himself transformed into something greater, a man who no longer fears the void but honors it as sacred ground. This is the final paradox, the secret hidden in plain sight. Silence cuts deepest when it is resisted, but heals most profoundly when it is embraced. The wound and the gift are not separate, they are one. The very space that once threatened to tear them apart becomes the very ground on which true connection is built. And so the story ends not with a battle won or lost, but with an understanding gained, that in silence lies both the death of illusion and the birth of truth. For her, silence was always power. For him, it became transformation. And for both, it became a shared language of sovereignty, reverence, and unshakable attraction.